Okay, we are going to begin chapter 5 today, lecture 4, chapter 5. Okay, and from now on, we will have entered the macroeconomics part of this course. Up to now, we've been doing general concepts / microeconomics. Okay, but from now on, we'll be doing macroeconomics proper, and everything from now on will appear in your final exam. Okay. The material that we've done up to now, chapters 1, 3, and 4, will not appear in your final exam, but everything from now on will. Okay? And in this chapter, we study something quite important, which is the meaning of the term GDP, which stands for Gross Domestic Product. Okay? And so in this chapter, we will do the following. We will first define GDP. We will define GDP, and we will explain exactly why it's an important figure. We'll explain exactly why the government takes all this trouble to calculate a nation's GDP. Okay? We will then describe the ways of measuring GDP. Ways of measuring it. And we will also distinguish between what's called nominal GDP and real GDP. And lastly, we will describe the uses of real GDP. We will touch upon something called economic growth, a term that you have already heard. Correct? Up to now, how have we defined economic growth, somebody? Does anyone recall what economic growth has been defined as so far? Come on, you have your test coming up next class. What is economic growth? Up to now, it's been defined as a rightward shift of the what? The production possibilities frontier. Is that correct? Right? Economic growth has been defined so far as a rightward shift in the nation's production possibilities. But we will now, in this chapter, define economic growth a bit differently. We will define economic growth as an increase in real GDP. Okay? So this is what we hope to accomplish in this chapter. We will make a start today, and I presume that we will need another perhaps 1 to 2 classes to finish this. Okay? So by Wednesday of next week, we should have finished with this chapter. That's the goal. Okay? So what is gross domestic product? What is the definition of GDP? Now, this here is a pretty good definition. It says, a nation's GDP is the market value of all the final goods and services produced within a country in a given time period, which usually is a year. It's customary to report GDP on an annual basis, right? So let's look at this definition closely. Now, there are some terms that I have circled in red, and let's look at them in some detail. Okay? First, it is the market value. Now, what is the meaning of market value? This means that we will be figuring out the value of the various goods and services produced in the economy. We're going to value these at prevailing market prices. Let me give you an example. Let's say that the US economy produces in a year 500 pounds of apples and 600 pounds of oranges. Let's say that this is the output of the US economy. Correct? According to this definition, the market value of these goods, how would we convert this? How would we convert this into market value? In other words, we need to convert these physical quantities that you see here, 500 pounds of apples, 600 pounds of oranges. We need to convert these into dollars, correct? And how do we go about doing this? How would we convert 500 pounds of apples into a dollar figure? We would use according to the definition here, we would use the prevailing market price of apples to do this. So let us say that the prevailing price of apples is $2 a pound, and let's say that the price of oranges is $3 a pound. Could we use these prices to figure out the market value of the physical output of this economy? 500 pounds of apples, 600 pounds of oranges? Yes, we could, right? What we would do is we would take the 500 pounds of physical output of apples, multiply this by the $2 a pound. This would have converted the apples into a dollar value using the prevailing market price, correct? And to this, we would add the 600 pounds of oranges times the price per pound of oranges. And this gives us $1,000 plus $1,800, which is $2,800. Am I making sense? So this is the first part of our definition. So GDP is then, it's the market value of the nation's output. And to figure out market value, you need market prices. Correct? Now, why is this important? Why is it important that we actually say market value? Because market values are objective. They are not subjective. Subjective means up to my own personal opinion or values, right? You see, the danger in this, in other words, if we don't use market value, the danger would be the following. Let's say that the economy produces spinach and cigarettes, right? Now, spinach is good for you. Cigarettes are bad for you. Well known, right? Now, what if somebody comes along and says, well, since spinach is so good for you, we should price this at $100 a pound. And since cigarettes are bad for you, let's give it a price of minus $20 a packet. Do you see what I'm saying? Somebody could come along with subjective values like that, right? But we don't want that. We want to avoid all subjective valuation. And what can be more objective than the prevailing market price? Right? So that's the point here. So let me repeat again. It's important that we use market prices to calculate the value of the nation's output in order to avoid any subjectivity in this. Right? The next thing that we will now look at is GDP is the market value of not just all goods and services, but all final goods and services. In other words, we only count what's called final goods and services produced in the economy. Right now, what's the meaning of final? It says here that goods are of two types. You have final goods and services, and you have what are called intermediate goods and services. Now, intermediate goods and services are used to produce other goods and services. So intermediate goods and services are, in other words, raw materials themselves. Right? Now, let's say that our economy produces 200 cars, yes, and 20,000 tons of steel. Right? And let's say that the price of a car is $10,000. That's the price of a car. and the price of a ton of steel is, let's say, $500, right? Now, if we simply figured out the value of the cars and added to this the market value of the steel, we might be making a mistake because some of this steel is actually being used to make the cars, correct? So if we count the cars and all the steel, we would be in danger of double counting the steel because some of this steel is actually dissolved in the cars. In fact, the reason why a car costs $10,000 is because it has quite a lot of expensive steel in it. Do you get my point? So if we counted the cars and the steel, we would be double counting at least part of the steel. Right? To avoid this type of double counting, GDP only counts what's called final goods and services. Now, what are final goods and services? Final goods and services are bought by their end users. Do you follow me? If I go out there to H-E-B and buy a loaf of bread, that loaf of bread is a, what? Is it a final good or an intermediate good? If I go to H-E-B and buy a loaf of bread, what would that be? It's a final good because I am the end user.
But what about like flour is a final good too? Because you can buy flour at the store as well.
Yes, it could.
So
Now, here's a good question. Flour. If I go to H-E-B and buy a packet of flour, that would make that flour, that packet, a final good. However, if I were a bakery and I went and bought the flour, that would make the flour an intermediate good. Do you follow me? So it's not really a category here. It's not as if flour is per se an intermediate good or a final good. The same good could be an intermediate good or a final good depending on who is buying it. Okay? Now, did you understand fully why we only count final goods and not intermediate goods? Because if we counted intermediate goods, we would be double counting them. Why would we be double counting them? Because intermediate goods would be within various final goods, right? So their value would be subsumed within the value of final goods, and if we counted them, we would be double counting them, correct? That's why GDP is only interested in the market value of final goods and services, okay? Next, we are interested in production that is being carried out within the boundaries of a country. That's why we have the term domestic. Domestic means what? Domestic means to do with home, right? So we're only interested in what's being produced within the political boundaries of the United States, correct? So all the production that goes on here within the states is what GDP measures, right? Now let me ask you a question. Let's say that across the border here in Matamoros, let's say there is a factory. These factories, as you probably know, are called maquiladoras, correct? So let's say that there is a maquiladora, a factory, US owned by a US company, let us say, but operating in Mexico in order to take advantage of cheap Mexican labor, right? And let's say this maquiladora produces $1 million worth of goods every year. Would this output be considered part of the United States GDP? No. Why? Because this is output, or this is production that's being carried out outside the US. It doesn't matter that the company is a US company, right? What's important here is that that production is being carried out outside the US. Similarly, let's consider a Toyota factory here in the States. Japanese car makers, as you know, have begun actually manufacturing cars here in the States, mostly in our southern states, states like Alabama and so on, right? So let's say you have this Toyota factory that's producing $10 billion worth of cars in Alabama. Toyota is a Japanese company. But would these $10 billion be part of The US's GDP or Japan's GDP? The US's GDP, because this is production being carried out here in the US, correct? So market value of all final goods and services produced within a country. And then finally, we need a time period, because production, as you know, is a flow. A flow meaning you have to have time involved, otherwise the production would make no sense. The production figures would make no sense. If a bakery comes and tells you that they have baked 2,000 loaves, you wouldn't know what to make of it unless you had time with it, you see. If it was 2,000 loaves in a year, that would make it a very small bakery. On the other hand, if it was 2,000 loaves a day, that would be a fairly large bakery, correct? So you have to have time involved, right? So in this case, the period of time that is customary is a year, correct? So GDP is typically measured on an annual basis. So the GDP of the US is so many X trillion dollars a year, right? So here is our definition of GDP. Is that fully understood then? So what is GDP trying to measure then? It's trying to measure production within a country. Production of what? Only final goods, not intermediate goods, because the intermediate goods are dissolved within final goods, right? Now we come to this very important idea, and this kind of explains exactly why GDP is, in fact, measured by not just our government, but the governments of really all the nations of the world. They all attempt to calculate their nation's GDPs. Right? Why bother? Unless the GDP figure tells us something important, right? And this is what we're going to try to figure out now. What does GDP tell us, okay? What information does GDP give us? And this will become clearer once we understand this concept of the circular flow of income. The circular flow of income. This is a very important idea, okay? And at this point, I'm going to go to my drawing board. And I'm going to quickly show you a very simple circular flow. Okay? These are two boxes. One of these boxes I'm going to call US households. The other box I'm going to call US firms. Right? We've already dealt with households and firms, correct, when we studied demand and supply analysis. Right? Demand is something that comes from households, correct? And supply is something that comes from firms. Okay, now I am going to draw a connection between these boxes. Okay, this here is a flow of something. This is a flow of something from households to firms. This is, in fact, the flow of money. What would this money be, do you think? Money that we households are continually sending to firms. Buying goods, exactly. Correct? So this would be what economists call consumption expenditure. So this is consumption expenditure. This is what we households spend on every day to live. Groceries, energy, housing, medical care, etc. Correct? So this is money that's going from households to firms. Now the money then enters the cash registers of firms. Now the question is, where does the money go from there? Once it enters the cash registers of firms, what happens to this money? And let's think about this carefully. You know, this division of the economy into households and firms is a bit of an artificial division. Why is it an artificial division? Because really, the same people who are households are also firms. Firms are, after all, run by human beings. Am I correct? Correct? So you wear two hats, in a sense. You wear your household hat, and then when you go out there to work, you're wearing your firm hat, in a sense. Correct? So all the money that comes into the cash registers of firms goes where then? Back to the households is absolutely correct. Every penny will really go back to households for the simple reason that businesses were set up for one reason only. Businesses were set up in order to generate incomes, profits, etc. for those who work in them and those who own them. Is that correct? So all the money that comes into the cash registers of firms will eventually make its way back to the pockets of households. Is that understood? So we are going to now draw another connection here. And this is a flow of money from firms to households. And what do we call this? This is called factor payments. Now, factor payments. What does the term factor mean? What does the term factor mean? Factor really refers to factors of production, and we have already been introduced to this, perhaps not in this way, not using this terminology, but we have called them resources in the past. We began this course by talking about scarcity, correct? Right? And when we were talking about scarcity, we mentioned that economists like to classify all resources into 4 types. Do you remember the 4 types? Come on. Yes. The 4 resources were land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. Is that correct? So these are our factors of production. Who owns these factors of production? Who owns them? These are all owned by households. Households own them. Households, of course, own their own labor, and they also own the land and the entrepreneurship and the capital. Now, these resources have to be bought by firms. Firms have to buy these raw materials in order to produce goods and services. And when these things are bought from households, households have to be paid. And those payments are called factor payments. Right? So the owners of land are paid something called rent. The owners of labor are paid wages. The owners of capital are paid what's called interest. And the owners of entrepreneurial talent are paid what? Profit. Correct? And these then make up our factor payments, which is money that goes from firms back into the pockets of households. Now this whole thing here, this is called the circular flow of income. This is the circular flow of income. Very important idea. Now we are shortly going to make this flow more complicated, but this is our simplest flow. Correct? Now one thing this flow tells us is that if you look at total expenditure in the economy, in our simple story here, total expenditure is equal to consumption expenditure, right? The money that's being spent in this economy. Well, in this story here, the only money that's being spent is spent on goods and services, that is. The only money that is being spent on goods and services in this economy comes from households. And so really all of this in our simple story is consumption expenditure in our simple story. Now, in a more complicated story, this will be different. In other words, there will be some other parties buying goods and services as well. But in this very simple circular flow, the only expenditure here comes from households. Now, let's say that households this year have spent $1 billion on goods and services. Now, the fact that they have spent $1 billion in goods and services implies that $1 billion worth of goods and services were then produced for them. Now, you can only buy stuff that has been made for you. Correct? So if expenditure equals $1 billion, this must imply that the nation's output equals $1 billion as well. Am I making sense here? Right? If you go and spend $5 on lunch, well, that $5 worth of lunch was made for you. Right? So this tells me right away that total expenditure in the economy is also equal to the total output of the economy. Output by firms, that is. Now, since consumers are the end users of whatever they buy, this output that we have here is an output of final goods and services by definition. Correct? So what would this total output be then? We have called this GDP. Am I correct? This is our definition, GDP. The value of all final goods and services produced in the US in a year. Now, if our households spent $1 billion in stuff produced by our firms, now that's key here. I've said spent $1 billion on goods produced by our firms. So this is a very simple story again. In this economy here, we have no foreign countries. So there is nothing, there is no case of an American buying something made abroad in this story because there is no abroad. Do you follow me? So every dollar spent by us goes into the pockets of or the cash register of a US firm. Do you follow me? So we now know that total expenditure in the economy is also equal to the total output of the economy. And the total output of the economy is, of course, the output of final goods and services, consumers being the end users of whatever they buy, right? And so this total output happens to be GDP, correct? But now we also know that this total expenditure is also equal to factor payments. So this is then also equal to the total income of households. Isn't this coming out of the circular flow then? So there is this important identity. Identity that comes out of the circular flow of income. And what is this identity? An identity, by the way, is an equality that always holds. And the identity is that total expenditure in the economy is equal to the total output of the economy, which is also then equal to the total income in the economy. Yes? Now, this here is our GDP. Correct? But we now know that GDP equals expenditure. It's also equal to income. This is our crucial connection. This is what's crucial here. And this will give you an idea why countries actually bother to calculate their GDPs. Countries take all the trouble to calculate their GDPs because GDP is equal to income. So when you calculate GDP, you are in a sense calculating the combined income of all your households. Now that is an important bit of information because it tells you how well off your people are. Correct? Your income, your personal income, is an indicator of how well off you are. And so GDP, which is equal to the total income of all the households in the economy, would tell us about how well off Americans are as a whole. Correct? And this is really why GDP is calculated. Because GDP, which is the output of the nation, is also equal to the income of all our households. And that income is a measure of economic well-being. Correct? So this is really the logic of why GDP is calculated. This is the important information that GDP gives us. Okay? I hope this idea is clear. Now what we're going to do is we're going to go back to our PowerPoints and take a look at a slightly more complex circular flow. Okay? And in order to understand this, let's simply go to a diagram, and this is the diagram. Okay? It's a more complex flow, but we'll explain this quite easily. Now, notice one thing. You have in this diagram, we have households and we have firms. The same two boxes that we had in our other diagram, but only there I put them side by side. Here they are like up and down. Okay? That's the only difference. You have here a flow of money from households. This flow of money that is going into, it's going all the way like this into the cash register of the firms. And this is our old consumption expenditure. You follow? And in this case, we denote it by the letter C. So C stands for consumption expenditure. C stands for consumption expenditure. So that's the part that you recognize, I hope. Correct? But now we have some other parties here that also shop, that also go shopping besides households. Who are these other parties? These other parties are now, so we have households. For some reason, the stylus doesn't work very well on the top of the screen. Households, we have the government. The government also goes shopping, as you well know. Our government, for instance, buys all kinds of things, including expenditure on our defense, correct? The building of highways, bridges, things like that. Our government spends a lot of money too, buys stuff, correct? So the government is another shopper then, besides households, correct? We also now, on the shopping side, put firms. I think about that a little bit. Firms are usually on the other side. Firms are the ones who make stuff, you would think, correct? Now remember, when we say shopping for stuff, we're only counting final goods and services. Is that correct? We're only interested in final goods and services because all of this really goes back to GDP. And GDP only counts final goods and services. Correct? Now when you think of consumption spending, all of this by definition is on final goods and services because households are end users of whatever they buy. The government, you can view the government as being a kind of end user too. They buy stuff on our behalf, in a sense. They buy stuff for us, and we are the end users, so that in a sense makes the government an end user. Right? Now we come to businesses. So we've been talking about final goods and services being shopped for. Right? But now we throw on the shopper's side of the equation, we throw in firms themselves. So firms are on both sides. Firms make stuff, but they also buy stuff. Yes? What is it that I'm talking about that firms buy? Now remember, what they buy must be a final good or service. Why do we insist upon this? Because these goods and services that are being produced are to be final goods and services. Why final goods and services? Because this output is supposed to be GDP. Am I making sense? Can you think of something that a business buys that is in fact a final good and not an intermediate good? Now, what are intermediate goods? Goods that are bought in order to act as raw materials, right? Could you think of something that a firm buys that in fact is a raw material? Everything that a firm buys is a raw material, really, correct? But the difference is going to be this. The difference is that unlike other raw materials that are dissolved within the goods produced by the business, a baker, for instance, buys flour, and the flour is dissolved in the bread produced by the baker, correct? Can you think of something else that a firm buys that doesn't dissolve into what's being produced by the firm? Because if it is not dissolved, that would make it a final good, even though it is a raw material, in a sense. Labor is dissolved. Your labor hours are, in fact, in the bread. If you were working for a bakery, and you were, kneading the dough and all that stuff, your labor is, in fact, your sweat, physically, really, maybe in the dough, correct? So what is not dissolved in the bread? Something the baker buys as a raw material, but isn't dissolved in the bread. Now, if it isn't dissolved in the bread, that would make that item, whatever that is, a final good. We would need to count it. We don't count the flour because the flour is inside the bread. If we counted the flour, we'd be double counting the flour. Correct? Right? But now we're talking about something, a raw material, all right, but one that isn't dissolved in the bread. Come on. Now think of our four resources. What are they? Land, labor, capital, entrepreneurship. I'd like you to focus on the capital part. In other words, yes, go on.
Could it be like, for example, if you're making bread, it could be like the bag you put it in, or like the shelves where you would leave it, or the machines?
The machines, yes. The bags, I wouldn't count the bags as a capital good. They are really part of the bread, really. You see? Because when you sell a loaf of bread, that packaging is really part of the good itself. You follow me? But the machines being used, the ovens, think of the baker's oven. The oven is a raw material in a sense, right? But the oven is not dissolved in the bread that it bakes. Do you follow me? Correct? So that would make the oven a final good. This would not be an intermediate good, because what's the definition of intermediate goods? Intermediate goods are goods that are used to produce other goods whilst becoming dissolved in those other goods. That's important. Right? An oven is being used to make other goods, but the oven is not dissolved in the bread. So that would make the oven a final good. So when we put firms on the shopper's side of our equation, the only shopping that we are concerned with here is the shopping for final goods, right? And so what kind of shopping by firms are we looking at? Their buying of machinery. Do you follow me? Their buying of machinery. And this type of spending by businesses is called investment. So we are now going to use this term here called investment or investment expenditure. And what is investment expenditure? It is purchase of capital goods by firms. So we have these three shoppers: households, government, firms. Correct? We are now going to add another shopper. But before I do that, let me just quickly clarify. The spending by households is called what? Consumption spending, C for consumption. Spending by the government is called government spending or government expenditure. Spending by firms, when we count firms as shoppers, what is that spending called? Investment expenditure. Because remember, the only shopping that we are concerned with here is shopping for final goods and services. And as I've just said, the only final goods that firms buy are capital goods, meaning machines. Right? So we've got three shoppers here. In our simple circular flow, we only had one shopper, households. Correct? Right? But now our story is more complicated. We have three shoppers. In fact, to this list, we are going to add a fourth shopper. And let me just clear out some space here. The fourth shopper in our story here is a shopper who doesn't live in the United States. In other words, this is a shopper who buys goods produced in the US but doesn't live in the US. Who would you call this person? In other words, this person is not part of households. The person we're talking about isn't in this box, because this box is US households. So who are we talking about? Someone who buys US goods but really doesn't live here. Now that party could be the following. Could be a foreign household. Could be a foreign government. Or a foreign firm. A foreign firm who buys American machinery. You follow me? The important point here is that that party is a foreigner, and we use the term rest of the world, or ROW, to indicate this shopper, the rest of the world. Now, the rest of the world buys stuff from us, correct? And what they buy from us would be called what? What would that be called? Final goods and services that they buy from us would be something that we would call what? Our exports. Correct? So what they buy from us would be called dollars X. X for exports. I think your book may be writing it as EX. Some textbooks use X, some use EX, but that would be the amount spent by these guys. Foreigners. Correct? So what do we have here then? Our household spends C dollars. Our government spends G dollars. Our firms, US firms, spend I dollars. And the rest of the world spends X dollars. Yes? If you add up all these dollars, would we get the total value of goods and services produced here in the States? Would we get our GDP, in other words? Because we have what the four parties are shopping for, what they're buying. Am I correct? This is the money the four are spending. Yes? If we add up these four amounts, would we arrive at what was produced here? If somebody says no, fine. Why no? Say? Now, let's say that I wanted to find out how much bread was produced in Brownsville last year. What value of bread was baked here in this town last year? And if I went to every household in the city here, knocked on their door and asked them, how much money did you spend on bread last year? Right? And they all give me a figure. Right? They look at their, they have a rough idea of how much bread they're eating every week, and they take that figure multiplied by 52 weeks, etc. Correct? If I took this and I added it up for all the households spending on bread, and let's say that I arrive at $1 million, would this $1 million be equal to the amount of bread that was baked here in the city? Why not? Because? Meaning a lot of our bread is actually bought not by our people, but by people in Harlingen? Is that what you're saying? That's a possibility. And so there would be this idea of exported bread that we are exporting to Harlingen, right? So if I know what that is, so I take the answers given to me by Brownsville households, and to that I add the value of bread that was baked here but shipped to Harlingen. If I add those two up, would I arrive at the total amount of bread that was baked here in the city? Would I? Why not?
Because there might be bread from other parts.
That is being bought by our households, exactly. When our households tell me they have spent $1 million on bread, that's the money they've spent on bread. That is not the money that they've spent on Brownsville-produced bread. It's just money they've spent on bread from wherever. Do you see my point? So if I take this $1 million, a part of this million may have been spent on bread baked in McAllen. Do you see what I'm saying? So in other words, when I take the C and I take the I and I take the G, this is the money spent by our folks being our households, our government, and our businesses. This is the amount they've spent, but we don't know whether this was spent on stuff that was produced here. Do you get my point? Some of this money could have been spent on imported goods. Correct? So what do we need to do? If we knew the value of imports, what would we need to do with those imports? Let's call imports M. We would need to remove this. Am I correct? We would need to subtract the M. This would leave us with the money that was spent by our folks on goods made here. Is that correct? Right? And to this, if we added the stuff that was made here but bought by foreigners, we are done, are we not? That would give us the total value of what was produced here at home by our firms. Right? And with that, I will stop here. You have an exam next class.